Right, Roger. I want you to imagine that we are the 2nd of June 1986.
Okay.
And you are standing there amongst a group of people listening to a really unknown film director who says to you, our job is to make the coolest vampire movie ever made. His name is Joel Schumacher and the movie is The Lost Boys. Do you think they achieved their goals?
Absolutely, 100% damn right they did. I mean, goodness gracious, Pascal, you and I have wanted to talk about this film for as long as we've been doing this podcast, and for various reasons we've had to put it off because we do tend to focus on a few films from the 80s, so we have delayed talking about this. But The Lost Boys, again, it's just one of those films that has almost become timeless. You know, it's definitely a film like Back to the Future, which we've always talked about on this podcast as well, that I can quite happily watch once or twice a year and enjoy it massively each time. But yep, it's a vampire movie, as you say, and parts of it are really quite frightening and really quite gruesome in their execution. But at the same time, it has got that coolness. The soundtrack of the movie is incredible. There's so much good contemporary pop and rock in there. The location, which was set in an imaginary town of Santa Clara, but was actually filmed in a place called Santa Cruz in California. And most of the movie is actually set on a boardwalk with a fairground. You know, you've got a roller coaster, you've got carousels and bumper cars and that sort of thing. And there's an element of family in there as well. But yeah, and motorbikes and cool costumes and obviously shoulder pads as well, because it was the 80s and 80s hairstyles. I definitely agree that they managed to make the coolest vampire movie. And I know you love it as well.
I do, and I don't think as much as my wife Denise Fintoni does, I hasten to add. I earned some serious brownie points, husband brownie points, when I came back from my second Comic-Con with a Frog Brothers t-shirt. Which had all the kind of design work and so on. And also when I had the immense pleasure to go to Los Angeles at the American Film Market, I went on the Warner Brothers studio tour and there was a shop there. And when I walked in, there was a massive poster of The Lost Boys. And there was also black and white stills of, obviously, the character of David, played by Kiefer Sutherland. And I brought that back as well with me. I remember seeing this at the cinema. And I think this is a film that is shot for the big screen, no doubt about it. And I remember when I left, I knew, although I couldn't understand why, that I'd seen something very special. But for me, back to your point earlier, what has remained ever since, I saw it probably in 87 when it came out, obviously on the big screen all over the world, the two songs. The rendition of Jim Morrison's, People Are Strange, and also Cry, Little Sister, those two songs have been with me forever. And I could sometimes put the soundtrack on its own via YouTube, or I still have the CD somewhere in the house. And you're right, it's just hit so many, tick so many boxes, that film.
Yeah, and Kiefer Sutherland, incredible performance. Again, he's got that element of being really cool. And then he just, the snap of a finger or the blink of a candle, he turns into this horrible, really quite gruesome looking vampire. But you actually want to be David, don't you? What I remember when I watched this film originally, I didn't want to be one of the Frog Brothers defeating the vampires. I thought the vampires are having a really good time here. They're hanging out on the beach with their mates. They've got all these chicks around them and they're having fun drinking and riding motorbikes. I want to be him. I don't want to be the Frog Brothers. They're the comic geeks. I want to be with the cool guys.
I think it's probably when I wanted to have a leather jacket myself after watching, The Lost Boys. But what is interesting, so I know that many people are aware from the backstories, but I think it's fun to remind ourselves. So this film originally was scheduled to be directed by Richard Donner,
who
had just finished The Goonies. and he wanted to work and concentrate on Lethal Weapon instead, and therefore had to pass. His wife Lauren was working with him, and had a great time working on 10 Elmo's Fire with Joel Schumacher, and obviously Joel was given the job. But to begin with, Joel Schumacher didn't want to actually direct Lost Boys because the original script was essentially the Goonies versus vampires. And he didn't want to do that. And he also just sensed that this was not going to work in 87. We're approaching the 90s. When you watch the special edition, The Lost Boys, there's an interview of Joel Schumacher who says they had prepared a fax to send to Richard Donner and his wife Lauren to say she turned down the job, thinking that would be the end of their friendship and perhaps the end of his career. Because, how do you turn down, Richard Donner and his wife? So he went for a jog, and whilst he was jogging, he actually imagined the vampires on their backs wearing leather jackets and being essentially, thugs. And he then spent some time to put his ideas down on paper, and then he said to Richard, "I've got this idea, what do you think?" And Richard loved it. I wonder there's a lesson for all of us content creators that maybe we need to go out for jogs a bit more to come up with good ideas.
I think they call it an idea shower, don't they? Most good ideas come in the shower when you're having a wash in the morning or in an evening. But yeah, getting out and doing some jogging. I think, the fact that they may not have made this film for that very reason is actually quite shocking. But again, the fact that, if you've got an idea in your head, sometimes, whether it might be lack of confidence or imposter syndrome or something like that, it might prevent you from sharing it with somebody. Imagine if Joel Schumacher hadn't shared that idea with Richard Donner. This film might never have been made. So always, if you've got an idea in your head, no matter how silly you might think it is, it's always worth talking to somebody about it, because it might nurture it and eventually it might turn into something special.
So, people say that, Richard Donner didn't want to make The Lost Boys because he wanted to focus on Lethal Weapon. I think the other motivation was he'd been so knackered doing the Goonies with all the kids running around that there was no way, with the original script, he wanted to put himself through that a second time. But you're right, So, in a way, by passing and giving it to a different director, The Lost Boys became a far, far better movie that people are still talking about. Only last year, they had won the biggest horror festivals organized near Santa Cruz, and the cast of The Lost Boys were there, including some of the musicians and so on, and they had one of the biggest Lost Boys party ever. That's one of the times I wish I lived in America.
Do you know, I think that's possibly one of the reasons why this film has not, above and beyond the fact that it's a damn good film, is that the location that they chose to film it in is almost timeless. Even though there's no technology like mobile phones in this film, it doesn't matter, because you can still go to Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk today and it looks pretty much exactly the same as it did 30 odd years ago when they filmed this film. And just as an aside, the roller coaster, the Giant Dipper it's called, was built in 1924, Pascal. That's nearly 100 years old, that roller coaster. And people are still screaming and shouting and going on it now. And I think it's because that location is timeless that it added to the movie hasn't dated. You could watch it, and apart from the silly hairstyles and the shoulder pads, it stands up as a modern piece of entertainment.
It does, but also because it's really, really well filmed. The way in which photography and the use of light and so on. Obviously, they had the cinematographer of Raging Bull, if I'm not mistaken, and goodness. That's also, I think, a smart move, on the production team to bring the big guns when it comes to, the crafting of the film. Because what else did they have? Well, they had actors that were on their way to becoming movie stars. But frankly, as we saw in 87, when the striking looking poster came out, there was no names on it because there was no point. No one knew Jason Patric much. People maybe had some vague notion of Kiefer because of his dad, but all the other cast were really, really unknown characters. But they did have a rather interesting tagline, which you almost hinted at when you were saying that you wanted to be a vampire because it was so cool. So on the poster and some of the DVD covers as well, you could read, sleep all day, party all night, never grow old, never die. It's fun to be a vampire.
Yeah, it sounds so good, doesn't it? It sounds so good. So what are the marketing lessons from this film, Pascal?
Well, I'll start with the first one, which back to my comment about how Joel Schumacher changed the script. I think you should know your audience and don't hesitate to make those decisions. So we know that the first script was a Goonies versus vampire style, and it was changed to essentially creating characters that were young adults. So they could be cool, they could be sexy, they could be violent and dangerous, but also almost, taking over. Because the story really is about David wants to take over Santa Clara and actually get rid of the head vampire by recruiting people like Michael.
Yeah. And I guess Joel Schumacher was an unknown at the time, but he did have that vision after he'd been out on his jog. And it was, again, it's the design of the poster, the typography, it was just so attention grabbing. Everything about the film, the cinematography, the lighting, as you say. Again, I keep coming back to that boardwalk setting. I grew up, as you know, in Blackpool, and Blackpool Pleasure Beach is very like the Santa Cruz Beach boardwalk. And every time I watch that film, it makes me think of home, with the sound of the roller coaster, the smell of popcorn and the smell of candy floss and the smell of the oil and the carousel. It's just very evocative. So he really had that clear vision as to what he wanted to put together.
Yeah, if I just close on that, for our viewers and listeners, I think for me, what you're reminding us is, don't worry about being an unknown. I mean, Joel Schumacher was unknown. I think by that time he made maybe three films. They were not like big hits. None of the actors were known really. To the fact that actually Warner Brothers took budgets away from them. I mean, how crazy is that? We don't trust you, so let's take budgets away from you. So even though you're unknown, you can still be remarkable because you have that expression. For me, the third lesson, which builds on that, is take risks. And what he did was to combine all sort of elements. I mean, in there you have obviously the fact that it's a vampire story, but it's also a comedy, but it's horror. You've got comic books. You've got a comic book store because, of course, everything happens in a comic book store. You have a video store. You have video games. You have music. I mean, the music in that film is essential because they use the album to promote the film as well. You've got fashion. You've got motorbikes. It's just great.
Absolutely right. And again, like we've often said on the show, ultimately, yes, it's a vampire film and it's cool and it's got motorbikes and it's got a great soundtrack. But ultimately, it's a very family orientated film as well. There's a lot of feeling of loss in there, isn't there? The main characters are longing for motherly and father love and approval, but at the centre, it's still got a lot of emotion, despite the horror trappings and the scenery and the location.
You're right, and I think the film works really well because of Diane West, who plays obviously Lucy, the mother. She's the group. In fact, that's the reason why, for those of you who know the movie really well, she's targeted by the head vampire because he believes that he's going to actually bring order to David and his kind of followers, and he's going to be able to obviously he himself take over Santa Clara. And for me, this idea is there's always essentially almost a normal story that is exemplified by having something extraordinary such as the vampires. It is quite good. I mean, when we think about the Lost Boys, its legacy in terms of how it has influenced the genre of vampire movies, because up to that point vampires were old men, ugly men, dangerous men, but they were not cool. And they were not, to your point, everyone wants to be David. Everyone wants to have that leather jacket and look a cross between Billy Idol and David the Vampire. But I don't think that without the Lost Boys you could have Buffy. I don't think you could have Blade with Wesley Snipes. I'm not sure you could have Twilight, the series. So, wow, what an achievement for a movie that even Warner Brothers wasn't sure, because when they were on set asking Joel Schumacher, what are you doing? Is it a horror? And Joel Schumacher would say yes. Is it a comedy? He would say yes. Well, what is it? I say, to the point when they took out, the budget away from him, they had to compromise on the makeup special effects. But actually, as you mentioned, they look really good. Those special effects.
Yeah, and this is incredibly geeky, what I'm about to say, I'm sure. But You know, I think that the Lost Boys also didn't tamper too much with vampire lore. You know, vampires in the Lost Boys still can't go out in daylight. That's why they go and sleep in the cave during the day. And, you know, we've got crosses and we've got garlic and we've got holy water. Quite a lot of those other things that you mentioned there, Blade and Buffy, did tamper with vampire lore a bit. You know, I remember seeing some films where vampires are walking around in daylight without getting burnt. But even in Lost Boys, they managed to keep, you know, the original Dracula type vampire lore, but absolutely pepper it up with all the modern youngsters and the coolness.
You're right. I never thought of that. She even kept the one about, you know, a vampire can't enter without being invited.
Yes, absolutely.
And then Max, when he meets, you know, Michael, played by Jason Patric for the first time, he says to him, because of course vampires are very tricksy characters, he says, you know, you're the man in the house, I will not enter until you invite me in.
Yeah.
And of course Jason Patric, the character Michael, wants to be polite and lets him in. So, well, listen, you know, what can we say? The movie is making Warner Brothers very proud. They recently actually released they actually acquired, you know, their own YouTube channel officially, and they are releasing. Oh, I'm not sure what they hope to achieve apart from maybe growing an audience online, maybe to have a future channel themselves. But they recently released essentially the Lost Boys preview. It's literally a quarter of an hour of the film. Maybe we have a 4K, maybe a special box set on its way. But even Santa Cruz, you mentioned a moment ago, they use as Santa Clara, the murder capital of the world. Now, if you go on the official website or the Santa Cruz, you know, tourist board, you can download a Lost Boys map where you can visit the different locations. I think there's 9 of them. So maybe that's something that you and I should do with Trish and Denise one day.
We should actually have a pilgrimage to Santa Cruz in California and visit the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. That would be amazing.
Now listen, Roger, I am absolutely sure that time is running short for this episode of the Two Geeks and a Marketing podcast. Perhaps if our viewers and listeners let us know, we could extend the film marketing segment, but we're going to remain true to our original structure. I want to leave you with a comment from Joel Schumacher. Sadly, we had to say goodbye to him all last time, June of this year. But he was approached by Corey Feldman during the filming of The Lost Boys. And I will say that it is known, because it's been documented in books and also behind-the-scenes interviews, that the cast were very worried that this film would essentially be a career ender for them. So the two Coreys, as they are known fondly, approached Joel Schumacher and they asked him, you know, will this film work? Will this be a hit? And this is what Joel said to them. No one knows if the movie is going to be a hit, guys. So we have to enjoy the heck out of it now. We are a family. And whatever happens is not up to us. It's up to the gods. So let's party on.
Fantastic. I love that. That's great.
And I wonder whether this is a message for all content creators out there. We never know what we do and produce is going to work. So when in doubt, just enjoy the heck out of it.
Fantastic.
This was episode 19 of Two Geeks and a Marketing podcast. Thank you so much for your support. Please leave comments, suggestions, and feedback in the usual places. Until the next time, go out there and make sure your content is better and faster and done right. He was Roger Edwards. I was Pascal Fintoni. Bye for now.